to include activist groups have realized this and have restructured their approach to include multiple forms of resistance. They are focusing on changing policy through contacting officials and supporting progressive politics, educating the public through teach-ins and amplifying the lived experiences of marginalized people, protecting our most vulnerable people through mutual aid, emergency funds, and smaller targeted demonstrations. UUs can learn from these groups. We can strive for an anti-racism spiritual practice that is repeatable and can lead to tangible change. If UUs are intentional in addressing anti-Black racism, committing ourselves to oppose it, developing consistent practices, and holding ourselves accountable to maintain them, we as a faith will be able to adapt and be welcomed in the movement for racial justice. Intentional spiritual practice can get UUs in the space physically and mentally to address racism, but attention makes the practice transformative. Last summer forced white Canadians to pay attention to anti-Black racism. White Canadians are now committing themselves to movements like Black Lives Matter. That is good, but just make sure that y'all are coming correct. White people start being allies when they recognize that they are the visitors in this movement. Black and Indigenous people, specifically Black and Indigenous queer folk and women, were doing this work before summer 2020 and will continue to be the vanguard after everyone else goes home. Reverend Aisha Ansano writes, white people tend to be visitors to the struggle for racial justice, ones that aren't forced to be there but can choose to come in and leave whenever they like. People of color reside in the struggle for racial justice by virtue of their race, end quote. White liberals often talk the talk and talk too much. They give the disclaimer before they speak that they are white and privileged. Their talk appears to show recognition of their visitor status, but their actions show the lack of true attention. I have been in many conversations where white people have commandeered this space to provide some off-topic or self-aggrandizing narrative about how not racist they are. My message is, be mindful of what you are saying and how long you are saying it. As a visitor, it is also crucial to listen to the authority of racialized people. Reverend Ansano continues, as people who are constantly in the struggle, people of color have the right to make claims on what they find okay and not okay, what they see as helpful and not helpful. In other words, it is not white people's place to say how we should protest. A compassionate visitor also takes accountability for their mistakes and the harm they have caused. It is easy to reject external racism, but what about when you are the one being challenged or called in by a racialized person? Will you dismiss it as a misunderstanding? Will you get upset at them for bringing it up? Or will you listen and accept the feedback so that you can continue to learn and grow? If you truly wish to be allies, you will accept our lived experiences. Trust us. I continue to do this work myself as a visitor in other movements. Since returning to Canada, I have expanded my activism to include supporting Indigenous sovereignty. Even though I am Black, I am also a settler. I am a visitor in Indigenous movements. There is currently a land back camp in southwestern Ontario called 1492 Land Back Lane. Haudenosaunee land defenders have been occupying the site for 10 months to stop a housing development project on their land. I have visited the camp a few times as an act of solidarity and to directly support their struggle. It was on my second visit that I had to confront my visitor status. After the injunction against land back lane was made permanent, a confrontation between land defenders and the police was occurring at the camp. Hearing the news, I quickly zipped down to join the fight. When I got to the camp, it was quiet and dark. I found two people sitting by the fire, and I asked them how I could help. They handed me an axe and asked me to chop wood for the fire. They told me the confrontation was happening down the road and that they needed someone to tend the fire until the land defenders returned. I asked, would I be more useful there? Hoping that they would say yes. They said no. Truthfully, I was a little annoyed. I had come down there to face off with police, not chop wood. Besides, I'm a city slicker from Toronto and was awful at it. I took a moment and accepted my visitor status and continued chopping wood. As a visitor, I had to trust the Indigenous people's authority. It was not until after that I realized that I was more useful chopping wood than being on the front line. Being a visitor requires consistent self-reflection. As I was standing in the camp just chopping wood, I had to come to terms with my motives to commandeer their movement. I did want to support the land defenders at 1492 Land Back Lane, but I also had selfish motives. I wanted to feel like I was doing something. I wanted to confirm my activism through another confrontation with the police. By paying critical attention, I could recognize and reject my problematic inclinations so that I could reduce my harm and work to be a true ally. By approaching the fight for racial justice as spiritual practice grounded in our beliefs and principles, UUs can be a progressive force for change. Black Lives Matter is now trendy. Many organizations are adorning the slogan and promising diversity initiatives. But how can we ensure that we do real anti-racist work that is not dependent on trends, but a genuine commitment to support Black lives? Here are my recommendations for practices that can be done individually and as a congregation. First is to adopt the eighth principle that commits to working to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. The proposed eighth principle has been the topic of fervor discussion in these last weeks. I was among many Unitarians that were elated when the CUC voted to approve the eighth principle and was crushed when the vote was dismissed. We are at an important moment in our faith here in Canada. In the 1970s, UU leaders walked away from the Black struggle because they were uncomfortable with Black power. Failing to pass the eighth principle in November will be repeating that harmful decision. A decision that will inhibit Canadian congregations from being truly inclusive. A decision that prioritizes white supremacy over Black lives. Although the eighth principle was formed in the United States, consider what last summer's protests throughout Canada showed us. Racism and white supremacy transcends borders. Justice, equity, and compassion is not specific enough to combat these systems in our congregations and society. The time is now. Although the CUC is discussing it at a national level, it would be a crucial step for the Comox Valley Unitarian Fellowship to adopt the proposed eighth principle as a congregation. The time is now. A second practice is to donate. Reverend Rebecca Parker wrote in an article, Spiritual Practice for Our Time, One of the 2 recommended practices to counter oppressive systems is to donate to just causes. The work of racial justice gives activist energy, but it often does not feed us or put a roof over our heads. My guidelines for donating are: try to donate as local and as grassroots as you can. It is most impactful donating to the people organizing and hosting anti-racist actions in your community. Black Lives Matter Vancouver is doing a lot of great work in the southwestern BC area. I am sure there are also several other groups and people doing good work in your community that would benefit from your financial support. Third, educate yourselves and listen. Read Black authors. Read them not to wallow in the tragedy of being Black in North America, but to understand how racist systems work and what is being done to dismantle them. I suggest the book Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard. Not a book person? Read the resources and articles on the UUA website written by Black Unitarians. Doing the work on the front end means that when it comes time for work on the back end, you are ready. Right now, racialized communities and activists are calling for the defunding of the police. These once radical ideas have become central in the fight for racial justice. I am also aware that many people are turned off by the idea. Before last summer, I also questioned the efficacy of the defund the police movement. What changed my mind was learning that the movement was about moving away from a harmful concept of public safety that relies on racialized punishment, but to investing in community through social programs and services. It is a complex issue, and I understand where misgivings over defunding come from. However, I urge folks to really do their homework on defund the police and the history of policing in Canada. Showing Up for Racial Justice, an organization I work with in Toronto, is offering a congregational action toolkit to help educate and mobilize faith groups on the issue of police. My final practice is to show out and speak up. Education is good, but the education becomes more meaningful when it is followed by action. If you are able, show physical support. If you are not able to physically show up, there are other ways. Write and call officials, a practice that was suggested earlier in the service in support of Palestine. Amplify the experiences of Black people and activists on your social media and to your networks. Reflect on how racism exists in your sphere and openly oppose it. As a congregation, you are in a powerful position to write letters of solidarity for activist groups. Seek out groups whose work you support, and as a congregation, send them a letter of solidarity. I was thankful for the support I got from several UU mentors and friends over the summer. I am learning that spiritual practice helps a person extend beyond themselves. That could mean pushing against the status quo. It could mean accepting the untraditional organizations that are leading this movement. It could also mean adopting new radical tactics to dismantle racism. Whatever it is, it should be uncomfortable, but it should also be liberating. Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt proclaimed, "Church is the place where we stand with one another. Look the world in the eye, attempt to see clearly, and to gather strength to face what we see with courage, and yes, with joy." End quote. Let us develop an anti-racism spiritual practice with courage and joy. I am encouraged by UUs that are acknowledging their racism, are present in the fight for racial justice, and are letting Black UUs like myself lead the way. Be intentional in dismantling anti-Black racism and pay attention to the movement. Feel the spirit of social justice and let it propel you into action. The spirit of social justice did not end last summer. The spirit will not be sidetracked by incremental reform or idle governments. The spirit will not be silenced by police and their weapons of destruction. The spirit is in the struggle. The spirit is in the movement. The spirit is Black rage. The spirit is live. May it live in us all. Thank you.